The hardest thoughts to think for a scapegoat survivor. One of the unique parts, I think, about recovering from being the scapegoat child of a narcissistic parent is how, in essence, good news is the hardest to accept about yourself. So, scapegoat survivors can often get frustrated that it's just so darn hard to think positive thoughts about themselves. Attempts to do so can kind of yield a sense of like inner nothingness, or just as though there's a chopping a tree down in a forest without anyone to hear, so it doesn't make a sound. Or you can feel just instantly repudiated at these kind of notions you might entertain that are positive about yourself, and or of course feeling like a fraud. And it can be confounding. Like, why is it so difficult to just think something positively about myself? And if you had to play the role of scapegoat child to a narcissistic parent, then there are good reasons for this. And that's what I'm going to talk about in today's video, along with giving you some tools to gradually increase your capacity to think the hardest, though positive, thoughts about yourself after surviving a childhood as the scapegoat. If you grew up in your own household feeling like you're always to blame, like you had to endure a steady diet of devaluation, emotional deprivation, and getting domineered by a particular parent or the family system, then you may have been the scapegoat child in your family of origin. My name's Reid, and I'm a licensed psychotherapist in California, and I specialize in working with folks who've survived this type of upbringing. I'm also a scapegoat survivor myself. And I started this channel a few years back because I wanted to describe what it's like to grow up in such a system, but in a way that does not blame the scapegoat survivor, but rather places the sort of accountability on the system itself. And since then, the thing that brings the biggest smile to my face upon reading it or whatever, or hearing it, is that these videos put words to what other scapegoat survivors have gone through. Because I think that's so important. It can happen in silence and isolation, this form of suffering. And so being able to articulate some of it and have it resonate with different folks is just, I think, so important in the process of recovery. So the goal of this channel and all of the resources around it is to take that understanding of what you went through and also, though, offer proven ways of recovering from it so that you can achieve a better quality of life. And that's led me to what I call the 3 pillars of recovery. Pillar number 1 is making sense of what happened so that you know it was not your fault. Pillar number 2 is to gain distance from narcissistically abusive people today and closeness to safe people. And pillar number 3 is to live in defiance of the narcissistic person's rules. So why is it so difficult to think good things about yourself after surviving a childhood as the scapegoat in your family of origin? I think there are, in essence, 2 reasons. First is the presence of, we'll call it, abuse. That is, when a narcissistic parent devalues, deprives, and domineers or controls you, but does so in such a way that you must identify as the person who deserves such treatment. And this always starts with the narcissistic parent experiencing the core sense of worthlessness in themselves that they just cannot bear. And so unconsciously, they quickly remove or project it onto the scapegoat child. But again, the job's not done there. They then need to do what I'm calling the 3 Ds, or devalue, emotionally deprive, and domineer that child, to, in essence, convince the child that they are the worthless ones and that the feelings the parent has just projected are in fact the child's own, not something the parent has just exorcised from themselves. And when this form of communication takes place from the parent towards the child, and it's a process called pathological projective identification, to be specific, it sort of weaves together a fabric of reality that's fragile, but has to be maintained by the child and, of course, the parent. And you may ask why. Like, why would a child, in essence, work to maintain this version of reality with their parent that is so detrimental to themselves? Well, It's because in order for sort of a child's self to come into existence, they need to find that self in the mind of their parent. And in the case of a narcissistic parent, what's in the mind about the child are these rather deplorable things because the parent needs to think such deplorable things about the child so that the parent doesn't think those things about themselves. So if the child now deviates from these conditions of what must be true in order to share in their parents' reality, then they risk going unrecognized psychologically by their parent. And that can sort of thrust the child into this terrible place, which I think of as being nobody to no one, where it's sort of exactly like the phrase says, there's no self there, there's no other there, because there's no reality, in essence, to share with the mind of one's parent. All this I'm making a point of because, yes, the child is prevented from thinking positive things about themselves in the shared reality with their narcissistic parent, but that's far better than having no reality with your parent to share. So the danger of thinking positive thoughts about oneself is grave. And that danger is, in essence, a traumatic stressor for the scapegoat child. And just like any traumatic stressor, you can think of PTSD, CPTSD, the effects tend to linger because it overwhelms our coping resources in the moment. And when such things happen a lot of things happen. One of them is that we can kind of confuse what's happening now to what was happening at the time of the traumatic stressor. When the psychological danger that was faced is severe enough, the scapegoat child and survivor, in essence, can feel like they live in a world where that danger is still afoot. In addition, the child learns these lessons not in a sort of verbal way. It's not like the parent saying, you need to not think good things about yourself, otherwise you won't share in my reality. No, it's learned in a way that's called procedural learning. Just like we learn to ride a bike or drive, these things are more sort of encoded in our bodies. And yeah, there's an interface with the mind, but it's just so reflexive. To avoid thinking good thoughts about yourself for a scapegoat survivor, even into adulthood, because of those procedurally learned lessons. The second reason why it's so difficult to think positive thoughts about yourself as a scapegoat survivor is the utter absence of reinforcement for thinking such positive thoughts about yourself. So there's a branch of psychoanalytic theory called self-psychology that talks a ton about mirroring. Mirroring is when a parent empathically attunes to and resonates with the actions and expressions of the child. When this happens, just like the term, kind of implies, the child sort of feels like they and the unique self they are is being mirrored, or they're able to sort of in a certain way see themselves in the responses of their parent to them. And when a parent is not narcissistic in the ways we're talking about in these videos, then what's likely to be mirrored are a lot of the child's strengths. And having a history of being mirrored in this way lets the child know that it is incredibly safe to think good thoughts about themselves. Unfortunately for the scapegoat child, they face, and like I said, this utter absence of such accurate mirroring for who they are. They are responded to as though they are a distortion of who they really are. These ideas that the child is undeserving or defective, and that when the parent treats them as such, that's all a fiction, but it has to be believed almost to one's core as the child, again, in order to stretch and feel like the reality that's shared with that parent is true. But the cost of not getting accurate mirroring for the scapegoat child is that what is good and true about them doesn't get echoed in the relational world. And that easily leads to such good qualities about oneself not feeling real because they weren't real to one's parent. So how could they possibly be real outside of that relationship, especially given how important the child-parent relationship is early in life. And the vicissitudes of that relationship tend to, get generalized out of that relationship and onto others, so that there's a quick and easy way to know who one is and what to expect from others. Of course, with the history of being scapegoated, this set of expectations yields a very grim and constricting quality of life for the scapegoat child and survivor. So I'd like to ask you guys, what sorts of positive thoughts about yourself do you know objectively to be true, yet still find hard to believe today? And I'd encourage you to leave the answer in the comment section below. So let me give an example with one, again, anonymized fictional client named, again, has a pseudonym, Harry. So as we worked together, Harry described having to put any thought he might think about himself through a filter, which would spit out very negative evaluations of him. He described it like a money laundering operation, where, instead of money, it might be good feedback he'd receive from others. And he would have to psychologically launder that good feedback through this filter to turn it into something that insisted there was a problem with him. So, like, for instance, he really liked to write. And as an adult, he'd gotten good feedback from, school, other colleagues, and other writers. But whenever he'd look back at his own writing, all he could see was what was wrong with his writing. He felt pitiful as a writer. And, when pressed, it was hard to kind of identify specific reasons that would held up to our evaluation. But that didn't change how viscerally or bodily convinced he was of being a poor writer, at least when he would try to reflect on his quality of writing. He could go ahead and write, and sort of in the act of doing so, produce really great writing by all accounts, but he couldn't know it. It was sort of a really adaptive, actually, in his history, sleight of hand, which allowed him to kind of actualize a really important potential of who he was as a person, being a writer. And yet, of course, the cost that comes for the scapegoat child and survivor is it feeling far too dangerous to be able to know what's good about yourself. And this played out with Harry, at least at the outset. So yes, good thoughts about oneself are hard to think, but there are things I think scapegoat survivors can do to help and gradually make it feel safer and safer in an incremental way to think those thoughts, and eventually find it much easier, again, over time. And as with all of these tactics, I can never emphasize enough how important having compassion and patience with yourself, I think, really is, because this process of recovery is not, it never happens in one fell swoop. As much and understandable as it is that one might wish that could happen. Could even make a good case to say it's not fair, and yet here we are. So accepting and even respecting the time required for these sorts of healing practices to really take root, I think can go a long way in making the process feel less disappointing and sort of in any way kind of reinforcing an idea that, say, you're inadequate or not enough or not able to do this well enough and the like. So the key to being able to think those positive thoughts about yourself is to build dissonance, is to generate experience that contradicts the much more familiar and easier to think negative thoughts about yourself. And when I say generate experience, I mean particularly taking actions in your own life and how your friendships and relationships feel and what they say to you about who you are. So although you may be suffused with negative thoughts about yourself or your abilities, this one example of applying this tactic would be to pursue an activity or a goal or a potential you believe you may have nonetheless. Yes, it may come along with a lot of self-defeating thoughts and feeling frozen even at times. But any movement made along those lines and push the envelope just a bit above where it was before. And then the next day when that activity is tried, it may get pushed just a bit more. The third day, maybe you can't get to where you were on day 2. But with that patience and compassion, that's okay. And so it goes. You stack those attempts over, say, the course of a year, and there's a lot of movement that can happen. So, going back to Harry, I mean, he was resolute to write every morning. He often wouldn't be able to feel good about what he had just written. In fact, was convinced that a lot of it was drivel, yet he would still do it. And, by the end of one year and then the next, it became a lot easier and more convincing to consider the good feedback he was getting from the people who read his work. Another way to generate such experience that contradicts the negative thoughts about yourself, of course, is surrounding yourself with people who express and endorse positive thoughts about who you are as a person. Maybe that means having a friend or partner who volunteers what they appreciate about you, or is really tuned into you and notices things you're doing in your own life that seem worthy of their admiration, and so freely offer that. These kinds of experiences are so essential to the process of recovery because they're not just providing the experience of being healthily admired, which was so missing as a child. In so doing, they're also letting you, the scapegoat survivor, know it's now safe in a relational sense to think these good thoughts about yourself, that they're offering a sort of shared reality that says, hey, you're free to understand yourself like I do, which is in a accurately positive way about who you are. And although it will likely take a lot of time, again, for this to set in, that is an extremely powerful mechanism to know that now it is far safer to think positive thoughts about yourself than it would have been in childhood. And to that end, I want to talk about a resource and a great way to generate this kind of relational experience for yourself of being accepted and valued as you kind of recognize and think well of yourself, say particularly recognizing your strengths, is precisely why I created my Breaking the Scapegoat Spell live online group class. This class is 8 weeks long and lasts for 75 minutes each class. The classes are limited to 10 participants to ensure a small group setting where a real sense of community can develop. And in the class, I teach proven somatically oriented ways to, in essence, interrupt the scapegoat spell. And the spell I'll define as the sort of trance that scapegoat survivors can find themselves when they feel forced to comply with the ideas that they're defective and or undeserving. But the real catalyst of healing in this course is the partner work that's done in each and every class. So each person is assigned a partner that they stay with for the duration of the class, and you'll work with that partner to apply the concepts that are taught in that class to your own experience, but then share that experience with your partner and listen and try to understand them as they share their experience. It's this kind of one-on-one sharing, I think, that makes the identification of and expression of your strengths feel real. Just as, unfortunately in childhood as a scapegoat child, there wasn't that sense of mirroring to know that what is good about you is also real. This class has been up and running for a few months now, and it's just so incredible to watch the validation that students feel and how encouraging it is to folks to know that they're not the only ones who feel and live with this sort of challenges that scapegoat survivors often do today. Breaking that sense of isolation is just, it's so profound and such a beautiful thing to be able to witness. So if any of this sounds like it could be helpful in your own path of recovery, I encourage you to check out the link in the description box below or by clicking here. Well, with that, I want to thank you for, again, your support of this channel and all the resources around it, and wish everyone, as always, the best in your own path of recovery from this, and in essence, towards a life that is your own and is so sort of eventually no longer marked or informed by this sort of role that had to be accommodated in childhood. And if you found the concepts in today's video helpful, then I encourage you to check out this other video on how a narcissistic parent can deliberately withhold endorsement of a child's strengths and what you can do today to value your own endorsements of yourself. Okay, well with that, I'll look forward to posting again next Friday.